Hello, my name is Wendy Patrick, and it is my pleasure to join you today to present the bonding power of social distancing, how being forced to stay apart has brought us closer together. I'm delighted to speak with you today because as a fellow Rotarian with perfect attendance, I might add, it's been very interesting to see how we've navigated this year together. And I say together because it's something that was unanticipated in terms of being apart. But what we've learned about ourselves over the course of this last year has inspired me to create a program designed specifically to address exactly that, how we've actually, especially as Rotarians, had a chance to meet even more like-minded philanthropists throughout the year with whom we have exactly done what the four-way test tells us to do, is build goodwill and better friendships. So with that in mind, I'd like to share a little bit about what I've learned this year. And the program is designed to hopefully inspire some creative thinking about maybe how we can keep up the trajectory of inclusiveness in 2021. So you'll recognize many of the slides that actually are from your lovely city. I've traveled all throughout Canada, so it is just a delight to be with you today in the capital. But I will start with recognizing that the concept of social distancing is perhaps not new. We have long known in pandemics past that we should be staying away from each other or at least trying to keep a bit of distance if somebody isn't feeling well, if somebody is under the weather. But we've never seen social distancing carried out to the extent to which it was in 2020. And that, as I'm going to explain, is what's taken a toll. Taken a toll on us emotionally, physically, psychologically, financially, but also has a silver lining, which I will explain. Now, what else did we learn about ourselves in 2020? Well, over the course of the first several months of the pandemic, we learned about reorganizing our priorities, or perhaps I should say, we learned more about our priorities. Maybe we just faced our priorities in a different way than we have in the past. Now, this is a funny graph that was put up at the beginning of the pandemic. Our need for certain things increased and our needs for other things tended to decrease. So, for example, if we were lucky enough to be able to telework, our use of our vehicle declined somewhat dramatically. Some people were joking that they were hoping they remembered how to drive, remembering what side of what side of the car the gas tank was on was something else that I heard people complaining about. Our use of the internet went through the roof, and so did our use of sweatpants and pajama bottoms. Maybe some of you are still enjoying lounging around, at least from the waist down at home, as your endless day full of Zoom calls continues. We also didn't shave as much. We drank more alcohol, but look at the top of the graph. Our use of coffee always remained the same. There's something to be said for consistency, at least in some areas of our lives. But here's what I really want to talk about. We learned that less is not more. Now, I'm going to begin this discussion with, and if I were there in person, I would use this as a trivia question to see if anybody actually recognizes this photograph. It is actually from one of our beloved shows of all times. It was the pilot episode of The Twilight Zone. 1959 October it premiered. And wouldn't you know it, the very first episode had to do with a man waking up in a town, beautiful looking town, but devoid of people. He was the only one there. The title of the pilot was Where is Everybody? Now contrast that photograph from 1959 with this one. This photograph on the bottom right was taken at the end of March. Where? Los Angeles. Hollywood Boulevard. Now, for those of you that have been to Hollywood Boulevard, you will never see it like this again, nor had you ever seen it like this before. But it looks almost exactly the same as that movie. What did we learn about looking at deserted streets, as you no doubt were doing the same in March of last year? That deserted shopping malls and streets with no people resembled end-of-the-world disaster films much more than they resembled what we would ever consider as an ideal day off of work. We were anxious, it was fear-inducing, we'd never seen anything like it, and it did not make us happy. In fact, quite the opposite. We ended up feeling even more anxious when we couldn't see anybody else around. Less is not more. And I say that because before that day, We probably thought it would be great to have no lines, no traffic, no horns. We turned out not to figure that's what we felt like at all. And we also learned that absence makes the heart grow fonder. Now, I wasn't at all surprised to learn that your city has several times been named the best city to live in Canada. And this is the type of thing that we have newfound appreciation for post pandemic. Now, I say post pandemic almost optimistically. We're sort of mid pandemic, but we have an end in sight. So we'll leave it there. But absence makes the heart grow fonder. We love the cities we live in, and we love them even when they're crowded. That's what we learned about ourselves last year in 2020. That absence did make the heart grow fonder. We did miss the traffic and the lines and the sense of togetherness that all that inspired. Now, there's got to be a happy medium in there somewhere. Nobody likes waiting in line, and everybody could do with an optimum amount of traffic. But to be absolutely in a city devoid of people, that was not something we enjoyed, and it is something we hope never to have to experience again. Now, a little bit of psychology here. For those of you on the call that are psychologists, you'll probably recognize some of this research. It has to do with the disruption that we suffered in 2020 and how that took a toll on our health emotionally. Now, there have been lots of studies that have been done over the years, both in the human and in the animal kingdom, believe it or not, that have come up with almost similar results. Nobody likes disruption. Disruption is bad for the self, the sense of community. It's bad for self-esteem. It's bad for a sense of togetherness, almost everything that characterizes the way we live in community. Again, both humans and even in the wild, we have to live in community or it causes us to become anxious, to become aggressive, to become almost toxic in terms of the traits that we evince. And that's what we saw happening in a lot of different communities in 2020. Now, we have seen this in the past. I know our last pandemic on a global level was almost 100 years ago, but even then, it was recorded that this is something that really was harmful. Now, we tried to deal with it as best we could. In fact, one of the things that characterized our reaction to the pandemic was how unique and how out of the box and how creative we were when it came to devising workarounds. This happens to be one of my favorites. As a person of faith, I can appreciate, and I did go through really the withdrawal of fellowshipping in community at my church. Well, in some churches, like in the Catholic Church, that has a lot of pomp and circumstance and a lot of sacraments that are beloved among the congregants, you saw priests and parishioners coming up with ways in which to celebrate and enjoy sacraments that you might say were a little out of the box. This is one of my favorites. This was Easter Sunday last year. This is a priest literally taking aim at his parishioners as they drove by. He would squirt holy water out of a squirt gun in order to bless them. And everybody got in line in order to enjoy the sacrament in the only way that was safe and legal and lawful to do at the time. So where there's a will, there's a way. That's the title of this photograph here. And this is just one example of the way in which we acclimated to a temporary new, let's call it abnormal. And let's have the focus on temporary, because we've seen restrictions wax and wane in terms of outbreaks and new ways in which we can and can't actually open up and close again, then open up again as we backslide into more restrictive tiers. We've been dealing with that the world over, but we have found ways to adapt because we have realized all the different ways in which we miss each other. Now, that's probably one of the most interesting parts of the research that I have found. Who do you miss? Now, many of us might say, oh, our relatives, of course, we miss our family members. Well, we also miss strangers. We miss the serious, but we also miss the superficial conversations because as it turns out, they weren't all that superficial. They actually were pretty significant. Now, this is Bar Robo. It's a Chinatown coffee house that you have there in Ottawa. And the coffee house barista example is one of the ones that I'll point out has been one of the most significant, is we miss that sense of normalcy, seeing the same faces every day, not just strangers on the subway, but also the barista that knows our name, that knows what we're going to order even before we order it. When we walk in, they say, "Do you want your usual?" We miss that. It's a sense of normalcy, a sense of consistency. And these are the types of discoveries that we made in 2020 that surprised some of us at how much significance we really did put on the interaction with acquaintances every day, not just the people that we knew well, but also the people that we didn't, because it turns out they had a larger role in our daily lives than we might have thought. Now, we also learned a little bit about the significance of seeing each other in person, and I mean seeing each other more fully than we've had a chance to do over the last 6 or 8 months. We always make the joke that nowadays we're going to have to carry signs so we can recognize each other because we are so covered up, many of us. So this is one great photograph that is an example of how people might have t-shirts printed that actually have a photograph of themselves with no mask. And in fact, we see in the medical profession in particular, this is actually something that people were doing. They were finding creative workarounds in order to instill that sense of community, that sense of intimacy, of chemistry, of the kinds of things that you just can't create, where almost your entire face is obscured with a mask. Now, this is your website. You've got a great Rotary website. But one of the things we've learned about ourselves, I noticed that you've showcased very well on your website. It's the sense of togetherness and living in community, helping each other, your outreach programs. They just look very different in an era of COVID. But we've learned how much we value being out there in the community and working in person, connecting, working together. And that leads me to another very interesting study that I was surprised to learn about. I am a career networker, and I can network with the best of them. And as a Rotarian, I've been to lots of conferences and district council meetings. And one of the things that I've enjoyed doing all across the globe when I make up meetings in different countries is that networking component, passing out business cards, receiving business cards. Here's a great study on networking. They actually, and this actually wasn't where it took place, I just happened to like this conference that you had in your home city there. It was called Research on Aggression, which of course I've done lots of because my day job is as a prosecutor. But one of the things they found when they looked at networkers is they anticipated finding that people that had to network the most would basically do exactly that. They would work a room with the best of them and they wouldn't take any time for personal conversations. But they didn't find that at all. In fact, what they found was the opposite. They basically found that people were people, whether or not they were there to network or socialize. So even those people that were there with handfuls of business cards, they knew they had to meet a certain amount of people, promote their business. When they got involved in an enjoyable personal conversation, they would spend an inordinate amount of time with somebody just because. Maybe they went to the same high school, they liked the same movies, or they just clicked. They found those personal conversations not only to be the most enjoyable, but they spent more time talking to people personally, even if it meant less time networking, when that was the whole point of them being at the event. We've learned that about ourselves during the course of the pandemic, that we value the personal relationships even more so than professional connections. That's been the bonding power of social distancing. That's been another discovery that we've made about ourselves over the last 8 months. Okay, so what do we miss? All right, we've talked about who we miss, what activities we miss. What do we miss in terms of places and why? Now, these are your 5 best bars there in Ottawa. I'm sure you each have your own favorite haunts and restaurants and places that we like going to. But let me ask you this. Would you enjoy your top 5 just as well if you were the only one there? I'm going to guess no, because part of the allure is the ambiance. We like going to our favorite haunts because they're crowded, they're fun, they're loud. Would rather probably not wait a couple hours for a table, but maybe we wouldn't be put off if we had to wait just a couple of minutes, because after all, it's the fact that there's other people there that makes it enjoyable. That is something else we learned during the course of 2020, that there are different types of places where we like to gather. Now, obviously, live music, going to a pub, going to a crowded restaurant, hearing other people laughing at adjacent tables, we like that. In fact, we sometimes look around and see what other people are ordering to make up our minds what we're going to order. We like that. Sometimes we even ask them, hey, what did you get? Libraries are even the same thing, and I've spent lots of time in libraries earning multiple degrees, as many of you have as well. And there was always something comforting about studying in a crowded library. It kind of lessened the sting of being maybe the only one studying if you were trying to do it at home. But there are different types of places people like to gather, and you just can't recreate that environment virtually. But people have tried. In fact, we always make the joke of endless Zoom calls. Well, believe it or not, even pre-pandemic, there were sites that you could log on to study or work together. Everybody would just be in their own squares separately, but everybody would be working together. In fact, some of these sites actually charged a fee to belong to them. Maybe you've heard of these things. Some of them started with everybody expressing their goals, what everybody wanted to accomplish over the next several hours before everybody just worked quietly. But you could look up and see that there were people in different squares that were also working quietly. Now, before the pandemic, people might have thought, oh, I would never do that. But now people are sort of rethinking the value of virtual company because of the bonding power of social distancing. Go figure. So here's another one. And this is actually a study that was conducted, at least in some limited fashion, during pandemics past that weren't global pandemics. H1N1 was one of the most recent. But here's what they did here. They were curious as to whether or not when people learned how dangerous it was to be close together, whether they would do it anyway and take the risk, or whether they would socially distance. And wouldn't you know it, they found that even when people were well educated on the level of risk, they said it's worth it to move closer together. The power of proximity has been just incredible to learn about. There's an optimal distance that people want to achieve, and wouldn't you know it's less than 6 feet. So why is that important? Well, it's important because we want to make sure we keep each other safe. Not everybody's going to get vaccinated right away, and the power of proximity is just so powerful. Here's how they studied this one. This was a study they did in restaurants in Paris, and they did it in an area where tipping was included, because that was one of the ways in which they decided whether or not diners liked the servers being an optimal distance away. So they used female servers and female patrons so as not to complicate the study with unnecessary gender dynamics. They found this: when a server stood closer to a solo female diner, not too close, but close enough, the server was tipped and tipped better. And that's when gratuity was even included. That has been the power of proximity. Now, they've replicated this in a series of different kinds of studies, but they always did it in an area where you don't even have to tip and you wouldn't be considered rude. And they found that there was even more tipping going on the closer the server stood. Now, we already know that restaurants are aware of this. This is also a photograph during the pandemic of a cafe, again, in Paris. This is the extent to which they had to go to keep diners away from each other. And I mean diners that were strangers. I mean, think about it this way. If you walked into a movie theater or a show or a restaurant and you were the only people there except for maybe 2 other couples, research has shown that as much as you'd like to think you'd sit on as far as you could away from the other couples, you probably wouldn't. It's kind of like if you went to a conference and there were only a couple other people there, you might go over and sit with them instead of sit by yourself all the way on the other side of the room, because we are innately social creatures. We like to be together, even if we don't know each other. And if you didn't appreciate that pre-pandemic, you probably appreciate it now. And you'll no doubt continue to appreciate it post-pandemic. And that is what the bonding power of social distancing has made us realize. So because many of us are on Zoom nowadays, let me give you a very practical example of how this might work for you, meeting remotely. It's called craving social cues. Now, if this couple showed up as guests at one of your Rotary meetings, wouldn't you want to know more about them? What's with the masks? Where did you get them? Do you guys like disco dancing? You would want to know more. And we do want to know more because when we meet in person, we have a lot of social cues to work with. When there is less available, sometimes less is more in terms of our interest being piqued. We see what we want to see in the background, and we look and we learn. And even though we don't have a lot of clues, in fact, some people make the joke that it's a good thing we can only see a little bit of each other because some of us have gained a bit of the COVID-19. But it doesn't even matter how much weight we've put on. We still like to be in person and maximize the availability of social clues. We really like that. So how is all this going to translate now into the post-pandemic world? Well, I love to travel. That's why I've spent so much time in Canada. It's also why I always like to use my own photos like this one, which was taken in an elevator bank on a cruise ship. The post-pandemic world is going to look just a little bit different. Let me give you a couple of ideas as to what we might expect. The new normal coming out of the pandemic, freshly vaccinated, we will probably still, even though maybe it won't be a practical consideration, we may still have a healthy level of respect for personal space. Now, personal space zones, that's almost a cultural thing depending on where you go. And I mean cultural broadly because some people were raised to just get closer and they don't mean anything by it, but sometimes space invaders are not always they're not always received well depending on where you are and what you're used to. But we'll probably have a newfound respect for personal space. There'll also be this newfound personal conviction for public comfort. What do I mean by that? It's true that if you're vaccinated, you probably can't spread COVID. But we also recognize that sometimes a mask is more than a practical way to make sure you don't spread disease. It also makes people feel comfortable, depending on where you're going, depending on who you're interacting with. Maybe they're a member of a vulnerable community and they would just rather you have a mask or a shield, at least for some length of time. Now, going cashless. Now, I actually came up with this one because I present to so many Rotary clubs virtually on this topic. And a lot of people brought this up. They said, how do you think that we're going to re-emerge as a society when we've become so technologically proficient, I'm paraphrasing, in terms of the way we pay for things? Now, we were already pretty proficient at paying online. In fact, some people used to joke they could make an Amazon purchase in 20 seconds because everything was already auto-loaded onto their account, even including the billing and the shipping address. But going cashless really has become something that has come into perspective during the course of the pandemic. And then, of course, this last one. This is near and dear to my heart now that we're finally turning over a new year. Are we going to make up for lost time? Now, I don't know about you, but my New Year's resolutions for 2021 have more to do with indulging than abstaining because I want to make up for lost time. And I know a lot of other people do as well. So our New Year's resolutions, and when we all are out of the pandemic, we're no longer masking, we're getting to go out, go travel again, we're going to have really relishing the opportunity to make up for lost time. So it's probably not going to be a season for losing, it's going to be a season for gaining, whether it's weight, whether it has to do with wealth, health, all the types of things we're going to enjoy more in 2021. Those are my unscientific predictions. But one prediction is very positive, and that has to do with what we're in for health-wise. Now, you know you've made it in life when you either have your own Wikipedia page or you become a cupcake topper. Like this handsome young doctor. This is Dr. Fauci. He is on almost every day here in the US. He's in his 70s now. In fact, I think he may have just turned 80. But he has a very positive prediction for all of us. And it's the same prediction that's being made all around the world. And that is that the end is in sight. So as we emerge from this pandemic, let's emerge better than we began. Having recognized the bonding power of social distancing, we are going to have a newfound appreciation of how being forced to stay apart has only brought us closer together. And that is great news for us as a global Rotary community. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. I know I've certainly enjoyed meeting you, and I look forward to meeting you in person the next time I am in your beautiful city. Thank you for having me.